The White House was to think strategically about and help advise the president where do we campaign on these issues here in Iowa so much. It was very much part of his platform. He knew he wanted to have climate policy part of his legacy. So I worked with Jeff and others across the administration to figure out what we could do with our executive authorities, but also what could we do to engage Congress to make sure that we have a lasting plan that would allow us to drive down greenhouse gas emissions and really put the United States on a different path for a cleaner energy future.
Yeah, that's great. I love that antecedent you had to the thing you just said. We can't have a conversation about energy if we don't ... We can't have a conversation about energy if we don't all get on the same page about a few basic facts that we can all agree on. So Tara, I think you've got a few of those facts at your disposal, don't you?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm working the audience tonight. A couple of you saw me with my selfie stick kind of having some fun beforehand. But we just kind of want to do a lay of the land. So we know we use energy in 3 basic ways: for heat, transportation, and electricity. But I have some more fun facts that Tessa, can you help me out? She's also going to get a Rock the Boat t-shirt and a OneNation temporary tattoo. I'm already rocking mine. So help me out. 3 basic facts.
Sure. By 2020, the amount of global electricity generation coming from renewable energy will be higher than today's combined electricity demand of China, India, and Brazil.
Cool, cool. Thanks for helping me out. Now give her a hand. That's good audience participation. Mitch, are you ready? I'm coming to you. I'm getting to know my audience. I already know where Mitch is. He's over here. I'm working my way through. Mitch, give us one more fact.
Today, more than 25% of all electricity generated in Iowa comes from wind turbines.
Wow. Cool. One more, Mackenzie. I'm coming back here to you, Brett. Thank you for volunteering. We're all the way back here.
Americans constitute less than 5% of the world's population, but consume 25% of the world's resources, including 26% of the world's energy, having only 3% of the world's known oil reserves, and generate roughly 30% of the world's waste.
Give him a hand. Thanks, guys. Back to you, Mackenzie.
I saw our panelists choking pretty hard on that last set of facts. It's a little embarrassing. But no, it's true. So George, I want to talk about, and the rest of the panel, I want to start to look ahead, in the next 10 years, let's say. That lay of the land, that's where we are right now. But I want to talk about your vision of the automobile grid, because that was one of the 3 areas that Kara talked about where we spend most of our energy. And when you and I talked on the phone last week, I shared a story with you how my brother 10 years ago had a diesel-powered station wagon that he was pouring used French fry grease into, because that was his version of clean energy. And we've come a pretty far way since then. So project out, if that was 10 years back, what's 10 years ahead in terms of clean energy for cars?
That is a great question. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. Great question. And I think unlike the fossil fuels that basically the grease you were talking about.
Do you mind if I just help you with that? Yep. Yeah, upside down. We got the smartest scientists in the world, and we got to fix it. How about that?
Is that better?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. So you were talking about a fossil fuel, basically, grease that gets put into an engine. That's going to change dramatically. Instead of fossil fuels, electricity. And you can now buy, of course, a variety of cars that run strictly on electricity, from a Chevy Volt or a Nissan Leaf, which is purely electric, and cost you maybe $40,000, to a Tesla Model S that's going to cost you $70 or $80 or more $1,000. The challenge is that market is so small. So electric cars make up something like 2% of the car population. We have to go to some number like 50% to really have an impact on climate. And that will depend a lot, of course, on where that electricity comes from. But I think your question was, how will life for the driver be different? And one of the very interesting visions is that once you have an electric car, you can put apps on it, just like we have apps on your cell phone. And those apps do everything except make a phone call. So many of those apps have nothing to do with phone calls at all, but they make our lives so incredibly convenient. So what are the apps that could go on a car? Well, when you're driving down the expressway and you want to know which lane should I be in, the app could tell you you should change lanes now to the left or the right. When you want to find the fastest route to your destination, of course you can do this with your cell phone now, but this could be automatically programmed into your car, so it would tell you, or in the biggest autonomous case, even drive you on the fastest route, or the route that saves the most energy, or the route that produces the least carbon emissions. So, but it can be even better. Those apps can have a GPS on them, so every car knows where every other car is, and if you can coordinate that, you could change the traffic patterns. So instead of spending, as we do in Chicago, an hour going home from work, it might take you half an hour, which is the time it takes when there's no traffic. So you could speed the traffic flow. That would be very much safer. It would save energy. It would save time. Who wouldn't like it? And these are things that you may think are 20 years off. When you look at what Google is doing and Apple and some of the other basically digital technology companies, it's probably a lot closer than that.
And probably safer too, right? I mean, humans are frail creatures, and sometimes we're not that great at driving, right? So if this automobile platform for apps could prevent us from getting in accidents, maybe our insurance premiums would go down, and we could pay a little less at that too.
I'll still take the bus.
That's interesting. I think you mentioned too, Carrie, you're interested in kind of how the Nordic countries are approaching this question, aren't you?
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Crutchy, over our conversations earlier, one thing that you said is overseas, you're kind of already ahead of us, and that's one thing I want you to touch on. And particularly when it comes to taxes, Norway is thinking that 100% electric cars, that's the way to go. They want to get rid of the gasoline. So kind of talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you travel in Europe, you'll notice this just in conversation with people, that the attitude toward climate and toward energy is really different than it is here in the States. So I was talking to a Danish colleague, and he was telling about their desire to get rid of fossil fuel cars altogether. Their vision is to have a 100% electric car economy. How do they do that? Well, of course, the technology has to get better. Okay, that's one thing. But they have an incentive. Actually, it's a disincentive. They tax a new car at about 100% of its value. If it's an electric car, the tax is not applicable. So you can save a factor of 2 by going electric. And I think if you look at some of the Scandinavian countries especially, but the European countries generally, they have taken this attitude toward efficiency in energy much more seriously than we have. And the population is willing to go along with it. They see the wisdom of it, and they don't fight back quite so hard as you might expect in this country they would.
Yeah, that'd be probably a long time before our domestic politics can support 100% tax on an automobile, but we'll see how it goes. Now, Robert, one way to have to get around that 100% tax of an automobile is to just ride your bike to work every day.
That's correct.
Which you do. So Robert was telling me, I was looking, it's going to be -9 as a low this weekend. So I said, if it were -9 and it were teaching day, and you teach Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, would you ride the bike?
Well, first of all, I'd put on my long underwear. I'd also put on my lobster gloves, still allowed to use the gears on the bicycle. And then I'd set out as long as there wasn't a lot of ice on the path.
That's an impressive commitment. Now, speaking of
pair
the
of those
path,
lobster gloves.
you talked about.
And if there's ice on the path,
climate control
they
72
also
degrees,
make
and you're out there at
studded
-9
tires
riding
for
your bike.
bicycles now.
Yeah.
No, but the path, you said, as long as there's no ice on the path, and that's something that interests me about some of your research. There's a bike path here, either on the west side of Des Moines or in West Des Moines proper. I can't remember which, for all intents and purposes, look like an
Plus we have
asphalt-covered blacktop
the
path,
B-cycles.
but it's not. It's made out of something entirely different. What is it?
Well, we actually blended traditional asphalt, which is produced from petroleum, with something we call bioasphalt. And it turns out that most of the trees and the grasses and the corn stover consist of something we call lignocellulose. What's in there is something called lignin that is very much like a hydrocarbon. And it's very viscous, very much like asphalt. And so we formulated it into what we call bioasphalt, blended it with traditional asphalt, paved a bicycle trail. And I'll tell you, it smelled a lot better than like petroleum-based asphalt. If you can guess, it smells like barbecue sauce. So in Copenhagen, we have a barbecue house called Hickory Park, and we're trying to convince them to pave it with this bioasphalt.
Oh, that would be excellent, really good. Yeah. If you think that's sexy, wait till he talks about biocement, which he will later in the proceedings. So we'll have to dream up what that smells like. Now, Jeff, I'd like to turn our attention to you. We've been talking about the transportation network, but I want to talk about the electrical grid, because similar to what George outlined in terms of his vision of how the transportation grid could change, you can foresee big changes in how we will distribute electricity that, when we flip the switch on, happens. So what's your vision?
Yeah, I mean, the grid, how we get our electricity really hasn't changed since, Edison, the time of Edison. In fact, if you brought Tesla and Edison back and you showed them the infrastructure that we use to generate distributed electricity, they would recognize most of it. Centralized places where we produce power lines that kind of run in one direction, go to an end user, either a house or a business or whatever, and we flip the switch and the lights come on. What's happening in the past few years, and it's really growing, is that people are starting to produce their own energy. So instead of relying on a utility to have a centrally located generation facility, people are putting solar panels on their roof, and they're using that electricity in their homes. And then when they have excess electricity, they're putting it back into the grid. So what used to be one-way roads are now two-way roads. We're putting more and more sources of renewable power on the grid. One, because we're concerned about the climate, but two, because in a lot of cases it's much cheaper than the traditional forms of electricity. And they have a little different profile. You can't turn a wind turbine on or turn a solar panel on. You're reliant on the wind and the sun. And that means that it's somewhat intermittent. You're going to have power generated from those sources. So the grid needs to become a little more dynamic in order to respond to those changes. And again, it's going from one way for hundreds of years to two ways. That was a big deal. Going from command and control structures where you had a utility executive or flipping a switch and determining when the power was on, to a place where individual homeowners in rural America, and there are places here in Iowa where they're private for wind turbines and they're generating their electricity there. It presents some challenges for the grid, but it also presents a whole lot of opportunities for cleaner generation, but also more resiliency, because you don't have a reliance on that one centralized power center.
You talked about how, as consumers take advantage of this newly two-way road structure, in other words, being able to sell back into the grid and different ways of storing energy and keeping it for later, which we're going to talk about a little more, that's something that you witnessed millennials favoring choices on that. And you drew a distinction or a comparison sort of like dropping the cable company or moving from AT&T to cell phones, that kind of our superstructures haven't caught up with where millennials want to be and where they're trying to be.
That's right. I mean, if you think about it, the utility structure was kind of a government-created and regulated monopoly. And the utility would go to the Public Service Commission and say, we want to increase rates by this amount, and we, are going to provide the following kinds of services for it. Those types of businesses don't tend to be very reactive to their customers. The long-distance telephone companies went through this. Some of you may remember when your choices of telephones consisted of black or white. You had to buy it from AT&T. That company, in 1993, AT&T was the largest company by market capitalization in the world. And not very long afterwards, it was essentially sold to Southwestern Bell because they wanted to use that brand.